All right, going live on Facebook and YouTube. And I am going to set up and give you a little overview of what we're up to today. So we're starting just a minute early, and I'm going to wait to see people logging in before I get into the main spiel. And as I see more people logging in, I might repeat some key information. The first part is discussion. So we're just going to sit and discuss. I'm going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to have discussion with Q&A. And I have my fiance / lovely assistant who will read your questions live out loud. And I will answer them. Let me grab a pillow. Yes, I'm also grabbing tea. Help yourself to some tea. Make yourself comfortable. All right, looks like people are logging in. Yes, I recognize you. Very good. All right. So make yourself comfortable. We're going to talk for a while. I don't have a set time for the workshop because there's Q&A, and I want to get to all that. It may go longer, and it may not go as long. So but basically we'll just do it till it's done. So anyway, my name is Gabriel Benjamin, and I've been a yoga teacher and a cyclist for many, many years. And I've had a lot of issues with my body because of those things. And I've learned about those issues also because of those things. So for starters, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on my history. And then I'm going to talk about the 6 natural directions of the hips and my opinions about some of those. And we can start with, after I tell my little story, we can start with Q&A. And we'll do some Q&A, and then I'm going to teach us some hip opening poses. Not a long practice, maybe 30 minutes, maybe not even that much. And we can do Q&A about those poses a little bit afterwards, and then we can say goodbye. So that's the format for today's workshop. I started teaching yoga just before my 21st birthday, and in September I'll turn 40. So I've been at it for a while. And I went to a teacher training initially because I was having severe problems with my back, and a lot of that had to do with my sacrum. And I've loosely titled this workshop the Sacred Sacrum, just because I've heard other people use that name for workshops. I think it's a fun, clever name, very marketable. But anyway, I have a lot of experience with pain in my sacrum, and a lot of that had to do with my legs and hips. So I did a teacher training, not a full 200-hour. This was a long time ago. We used to have Flintstones cars. You used to pedal with your feet back then, 19, 20 years ago. So back then there wasn't the whole 200-hour thing, and things weren't as strict in terms of getting a job doing yoga. So I took a training just for a weekend, and then after that, people were asking me to substitute because they knew I had gone to a teacher training. And so in that training, what we were doing mostly was a lot of muscle tone work and core work for the lower back. And my history previous to that was cycling from 16 onward. This was, 3 years of very vigorous cycling and some bad crashes. And I was doing yoga. I started at about 17 with a little bit of yoga. And then at 18, I was doing yoga every day. But when it would be cycling season and race season, I switched from taking classes. The classes were more well-rounded, where I would have more strengthening in the core and more muscle work in my back. And when I would be in race season, I just did the stretches I liked, which didn't involve any of the muscle work in my back. And when I got injured, just from overtraining, I tried to stretch it all out. So I did swan forward bend, or what a lot of people know as pigeon. I would do hamstring forward bends, I'd do twists. I just tried to stretch and pop things through stretching. And I got worse, and I really wanted to figure things out. So I went to teacher training to learn about my back. And we were doing all the things that I didn't like, the toning of the glutes and the hamstrings and the lower back. And those were the things I needed to start making a staple of in my daily routine to have a stable back. So when I learned that, and when I also improved my posture, my back was significantly better. Like, interestingly enough, like at 39 and all through my 30s, really, like I start to feel some stuff in my back, or if I push it too hard, like my sacrum doesn't feel good. But I have way less pain in my body as a 39-year-old than I did when I was 19, which is crazy, because the whole sort of stereotype is when you're 19, you're invincible, and then you're 39, 40, you're done, you're over the hill, right? And that's when you start to hurt and not be able to perform physically. And for me, it was the other way around. So anyhow, my history of teaching just started through injury, and it started through pain. And I tried to ignore the pain and just, train through it and push really hard, do my, normal level of exertion for all the things I did, yoga class, bicycling, etc. And that didn't work. I got worse. And so learning about, first of all, taking care of myself when I wasn't well, and then also being more holistic with my muscle tone work and how I stretched was really key to getting stable. And all through my 20s, like, I got much better, but I hurt myself a lot still. So I switched from overtraining on the bike to overtraining in yoga, doing advanced poses. And so I was able to, I learned how to fix my sacrum, but I also continued to break it. So, ironically, as sacred as the sacrum is, I didn't treat it as such. I kept breaking myself. I switched from doing competitive racing to doing advanced yoga, but I just turned that into one more thing that, put my body through the meat grinder. So anyway, I have quite a bit of experience. I've had a lot of other injuries too. There's pretty few parts of my body that haven't been injured, truthfully, and I've been really grateful to learn about how to adapt it and cope with that with yoga and a lot of other lifestyle methods that we can talk about later, perhaps. A lot of things from Ayurveda have been very key for dealing with body pain. But in teaching, I've, ultimately all the body pain and the injuries and the things that have held me back have helped me be a better teacher, I think, because I've been able to relate to students who have had a lot of pain. And I've been able to use some of my experience to help students who've had similar things. So in a strange way, it's a blessing. And, I've also really observed a lot of things. Just as a teacher, you do something for nearly 20 years. You learn a lot from the people you observe. Like if you're open to seeing what's going on with people, then on the outside you see a lot of patterns, and then you get to know people and you see patterns on the inside. And one of my patterns was always pushing and stubbornness, and maybe trying to show off a bit too much, and that kept leading me back to pain. And when I developed just the right amount of push and pull, using effort and then taking rest, which is a principle that I teach a lot of nowadays, then I was able to have much more of a harmonious experience in my body. Not as much pain in my back and my hips and sacrum. So ultimately that's been a really good thing. But in observing people and talking to people and listening, I've observed some really interesting things about people's pain and injury and alignment, and their attitudes toward that. And one of the key takeaways that I started to figure out early on is that, when someone says they have maybe pain in their glute or pain in their sacrum or pain in their back, it's very likely there's a lot of overlap between what you have going on in your body, and it's also quite possible that what they need and what they're going through is very different than what your experience is, right? So my body tends to be a little bit more fixed. I'm flexible, but I'm not what would be considered loose jointed. And so sometimes you have pain because your joints are stuck. And then sometimes you have pain because your joints are immobile or excessively mobile. Is that the correct phrase? Am I speaking English properly?
Hypermobile.
Hypermobile is the phrase we're looking for. And so what a person who's really tight and stuck needs versus a person who has really, really loose joints needs are very different things, right? So you hear people, talk about, oh, this is how I fix my back, and you should do it too, right? And that's understandable. People get really excited about what works for them, and they want other people to get excited about what works for them. And that's easy too, It's very simplified to just be like, follow me, I know the way, It's just like, okay, well, that way is a way. And there's also a lot of different ways, different paths, different experiences, right? It's like if there's a mountain, the base has this wide perimeter, so there's like endless ways to get to the top. Like the top is all one destination, but all the routes along the way are, vary greatly. And there's different benefits to those different routes. So anyhow, it was hard for me when I started to discover, different techniques, different alignments, people who needed different things, because it's more complicated. It's a lot more to think about. It's a lot more to consider, and it's not easy. If you can just have one easy answer, oh, this hurts. Oh, do that. Boom, done, fixed. Then that's quick and fast and easy, versus having to explore people's uniqueness and all the different things that are adding up to getting to that moment in time where your body is struggling. That's a lot more complicated, and you can't do that quickly, and you can't be lazy about that. So anyway, it was a very good experience to learn about that. It's very humbling to learn about all the different variations that come into why somebody has the experience they're having. And it's also, like I was saying, it's complicated. So I would just encourage you to be aware of people who have the one answer fixes all method, and just know I'm gonna tell you some things that I think work, and just know that I don't have all the answers, right? And what I have to say may or may not work for you. And I know that's not a super compelling selling point, but it's a lot more honest than what you'll hear from a lot of people. And it's what I believe is the truth. So if you can glean some information and also learn from your own experience, knowing that your experience has a lot of overlap with others, but ultimately is a unique experience, then I'll feel really good about information I pass along. So anyway, that's a little bit about my background. And that's a little bit about the world of yoga. Have you noticed when you take class with teachers that teachers have a lot of different things to say about poses? You know, do it this way. Have your arms this height. No, have them this height. You know, have your knee here. No, have your knee there. Like, do it like this. No, well, I was taught to do it like that. You know, and you know, I've seen that. You know, I've taught a lot of classes, and I've been a student in a lot of classes with a lot of different teachers who have a lot of different backgrounds. Even teachers who are teaching the same method still have their own view and approach and ideas. It's more likely to be congruent, but you know, everybody you learn from, you have different information coming from them. And so that can be confusing sometimes. But I'm all for it. I think having different methods, different ways, and different ideas is good. But what I've seen a lot of is the do it this way mentality. And there's a few things that go along with that. Sometimes that's just it. Do it this way. This is the correct form of yoga. This is the correct way to do this pose. Period. No questions. Boom. That's it. Right? People like that because it prevents you from having to think. And it's just done. It's simple. Game over. But it's not correct, in my opinion. Now, if somebody says, do it this way, and then they have a because of X, Y, and Z, then that's much better. Like a teacher being very pragmatic or even authoritarian is less of a problem, in my opinion, so long as they have really good information, really good experience to back it up. You know, you should always be willing to ask a teacher, why should we do it this way? You know, or why not do it the other way? And then be critical of their answer. Do they have an answer, right? Does their answer make sense? Do they just talk in circles, kind of like a politician, so that your question magically goes away and they can hold their state of authority over the group? You know, I've seen a lot of that in the yoga world. And I'm not a fan. Let's just say. But people eat it up, you know, and because it's easy. But, you know, one of the worst things you can take on as a student or a teacher, in my opinion, is just doing it that way. You know, well, my teacher told me to do it this way. You know, did they tell you why? No. Do you have an answer? Did you figure out why on your own? Why we should do cat-cow with a hyperextended chin, or all these other things that people do? that I question, and that people have a right to question. You know, if you've got an answer, and if the answer is thought through, then that's one thing. But if it's just like, well, that's just what I was taught, you know, well, that's not good, right? Things are very broad and a lot more complicated than just this oversimplification that we seek in learning. So, but it's understandable, you know, people like to develop a relationship. A teacher often has this sort of, you know, mystique and hierarchy about them, and people like to seek approval and develop a relationship and show that they're, you know, a good little follower of that teacher. And so you just smile and nod, then that works for that. But then that develops a little bit more of a codependent student-teacher relationship that has its benefits for sure, but also has its problems, right? I mean, one of the things that I believe more and more about poses and experiences is that everything has a pro and a con, right? When we do our practice, we're going to lead up to a peak pose that I think is really, really good for the sacrum and has been really excellent for my sacrum. But I'm also going to tell you about why it might not be good for you, you know, why it might be too hard on the knees or not feel good on the hips, right? There's no holy grail, right? There's just a lot of different ideas, right? And you have to find what works for you. And it doesn't happen quickly. It comes through a lot of trial and error. Right? So sorry for not giving you the easy answers or the quick fix of the one size fits all. You can probably find someone out there who'll do that for you, but that's not me. So my apologies. Or what is that trendy saying that people say so much? Sorry, not sorry. Yeah, definitely. You know, I feel you if that's hard for you, but I mean, I'm not going to change to make you happy. I'll try and make you laugh, but not everybody likes my humor, and that's totally fine too. We find the right teachers for the right experience we need. You know, lots of teachers out there. So anyway, yeah. Every person, every situation, every pose, it has a pro and a con. You know, there's no one best pose. There's no one best hip opener. You know, there's things that it's good for and things that it's not good for. You know, and yeah, there's just a lot of that. There's a lot of that in life. You know, in the modern New Age community, we talk a lot about being limitless. Oh, we're so limitless, you know. And you know, it's nice to take yourself out of a lot of self-limiting beliefs, and all for that, 100%. But you know, people forget that there's a purpose to limitations. Like what if your roof is limitless, right? And then you try and run the heat, and all the heat rises up to that really limitless roof, versus having a limit to your roof, and then you can have a container to keep your house warm when it's rainy or snowy out, right? That's a good limit. And then if the limit comes down too low and you're tall and you're bumping your head on the roof, that's a bad limit, right? So even limitations are good and have their purpose, and it's how it's applied. You know, people forget about context, right? Nowadays, context is not something people enjoy as much in a lot of situations, not just in yoga. But you know, the context that things are applied to, you know, doing the splits when you're healthy and you've been training for it for a long time is going to be an amazing experience, especially if you take a picture of it and post it on Instagram, get a bunch of likes, get all that dopamine going in your brain like you're on coke or something like that. But then try and do the splits and overwork it, and you know, hurt your sacrum and hurt your knee. You know, the hamstring connects to the tailbone, and then also wraps around and connects to the front of the knee. So you can not just hurt your hamstring from forcing the splits, but you can hurt other parts of your body because of that. So it's like, so what is it? Is the splits a beautiful thing, or is it this horrible, injurious thing, this vehicle towards pain? Well, depending on the context, you might say, oh no, I tore my hamstring. Or you would say, Jai Hanuman. Yes, victory to the flow. All right, so anyway, that's a little bit of what I have to say about approaching methods in yoga. Be careful of one-stop shop alignments. Different people need different things. And we're going to get into discussing the directional movements of the hips, and then we'll take some questions if people would like to hear what I have to say about your question. Is there a question already?
If Facebook is glitching, which I've been finding it is, just remind people they can.
Oh, yes. Thank you. So if the sound or if any problems happen on Facebook, or if it just pauses, just know that we're doing this on YouTube Live also.
I posted a link. And
there's a link posted to YouTube Live. So please check that out if Facebook's not working. And questions can be put on YouTube Live as well as Facebook Live. I like being able to see who's on Facebook. I don't think unless you ask a question on YouTube Live, I don't think I get to see who's on there. So Facebook is nice, and if it's working for you, keep doing it. But if it's not working for you, switch over to YouTube Live, and you might even be able to play that on a smart TV. If you can't figure that out, you definitely can do play back. The videos get saved, so you can play that back on your TV if you want to do more of the big screen yoga experience. Okay, so let's get into the 6 natural directions of the hips. There's also 6 natural directions of the spine, and sometimes the 2 go together, but we'll start with the hips. I may touch on the spine stuff a little bit later, maybe when we're doing some of the poses. And so the way I'm sitting right now in this triangle base, this cross-legged pose, I have my knee bent and my hip is rotating outward. So the femur, the main bone of the thigh, and the head of that in the hip socket has to rotate out for my knee to bend and open out. So that's external rotation. And you see that a lot in classical yoga postures. Okay? External rotation, you can do like feet together, knees opening, sitting in lotus, doing a swan or a pigeon. All of that is external rotation. And usually it involves having the knee bent, although there's some alignment cues where you apply a little bit of that external rotation, like in Trikonasana is a good example of that, and other things as well. So that's the first one I'll mention. And then, so say for instance, if I was sitting differently, if I were sitting with my heels wide and sitting between my heels, and you see how my knees are rotating in, and so this is called Virasana. Some people call it tortoise or a hero pose, and it's a big stretch on the thighs and the shins. A lot of times the knees don't feel good, so people need to sit on a cushion. Even if your hips are very flexible, like if you do butterfly and like Sukhasana or Padmasana, lotus, very easily, this might not be easy at all. In fact, a lot of times when your external rotation is really good, your internal rotation is not as good. So if that's the case, then just take your pillow and sit on this. I'm not meaning for you to do these poses right now, just so you know, by the way. I'm just showing some different examples, right? But so this is internal rotation of your hips, or the femur, the femoral head and the hip socket. So that's the first 2, external rotation, internal rotation. And internal rotation can be used in a lot of back strengthening poses, or like a subtle sense of internal rotation to prevent loading up the backs of your hips and the sacroiliac joint and the iliac spine. So internal rotation is good. In my opinion, and from what I've experienced, and my experience, for one individual, I have a lot of experience, but for all the experience and all the yoga that's been taught in the world, it's definitely, it's definitely limited. But in my experience, there's a lot more external rotation taught in typical yoga classes than internal rotation. And I think internal rotation is really good for a lot of issues when you do get a stuck sacrum. And even if you're not having injuries, if you want to approach things from a well-rounded point of view, then it's good to use all the directions that the joints are designed to move and get those muscles used to the different strengthening and releasing motions of using those different directions. Athletes develop injuries a lot because, or even people who work at a desk do the same thing with like a mouse. And when you're doing the same thing, you're overworking certain areas and then other areas are completely neglected, then it leads to a lot of problems. So it's good to be well-rounded in different directions of movements of the hips. So external, internal, those are the first two. All right, what else do we have? We have a forward bend motion for the hip. So like if I were to stretch my hamstring, and this is also a forward bend, this example is a forward bend for the back too. Let's say I was to do a forward bend and stretch my hamstring, well then the hip is in a forward bend here. The hip is doing a flexion, it's called. Right? And an example of doing that with the hip without doing it with the back. So this pose is flexion for the back and flexion for the hip. And then this knee that's bent is in external rotation, right? But that's the secondary, this is the primary, right? So let me give you a pure example of flexion for the hip with a neutral back. So no other hip rotation is happening on the other leg. The back is not doing anything other than being neutral. So like stretching your hamstring like this is a flexion for the hip. So the hip is moving in a forward bending motion, right? That's a flexion for the hip. So that's the third flexion of the hip, forward bend for your hip, which a lot of forward bends for your back end up being forward bends for your hips as well. Question? We have a visitor. This is Willow, the cat, coming to give you high praise and blessings. Okay, so the next direction of the hip is an extension of the hip. So this example I'm going to give, the runner's pose, is actually a flexion and an extension for the hip. So this leg is an extension. This leg is bending back, right? A back bend for the hip. And then this leg is moving forward. This leg is in flexion. And then if say for instance I were to bring my foot forward and make a split, then that's a full flexion and extension for the hips, doing Hanumanasana. So I can give you an example of something that's just purely an extension for the hip, but truthfully the deepest stretches that are felt in the hip back bend, the hip extensions, are usually combined with another hip movement, like doing a pigeon, a lunge, Hanumanasana, and so forth. So like if I were just standing and just moving my leg back, So this hip is neutral and this one is extending, but I don't feel a big hip stretch. That's not really a typical yoga pose, but commonly people will lay down. And then when you lift your legs and your chest, like in locust, your hips are actually doing an extension. But that's combining a back movement with the leg movement. So say I just lifted one leg, and then I don't feel a huge stretch. I feel a lot more muscle tone, but I am using the mobility in my hip. That's a pure extension of the hip without any other things going on. I mean, my neck is extended a little bit. That is the traditional alignment of the locust. If you had your forehead on the ground, I was also lifting my head to speak to you all, but if you had your forehead on the ground, then everything would be neutral and just your leg is lifting an extension. It's a back bend for the hip. Now, it's easy not to think of that as a back bend or as even a hip pose because you don't feel much of a stretch in your hip. You feel a lot of contraction of the muscles in your hamstring and your glute and your low back. Those were the ones that I needed to get my joints to really feel good and have muscular strength that counterbalanced all the movement I was doing on my road bike. It was constantly neck up, the back rounded, and developing a lot of strength in the front of my legs. So the body doesn't do so well when it doesn't have strength in the front and the side and the back relatively even. Like, it doesn't have to be perfectly even, but when you're heavily strengthened in one direction and then very weak in another, then you're just ripe for problems. You're on the road toward injury. If you have fantastic genetics and just great luck, you can get away with all kinds of things. That's one of the things I've experienced in the world is some people do things really carefully and they still have problems. And some people are just careless and their body never hurts. So, and I can't explain that other than just saying, part of it's genetics and also the mind frame you're in. People who do careless things, but they don't worry about it. They don't have stress in their mind. And then therefore their body has a little bit less stress, but it's probably, and that mind frame might be genetic as well, just like being resilient and not giving an F about, being careless about things. But anyhow, so that's 4. We had external opening of the hip, internal rotation of the hip. We had moving the hip forward, flexion or forward bend of the hip. We have moving the hip back. That's extension. And then the next 2 are abduction and adduction. So abduction would be to have, it's similar to like external rotation. You would think that these 2 types of poses are going to help each other, which sometimes they do, but they may not. But like moving the leg out, like in a straddle, you're doing an abduction of both legs, right? Abduction refers to going away from the center. So this is a abduction of both legs. Some poses just do one leg at a time. The other leg is stable. And you can use some rotation to go deeper. So like a lot of times in this pose, people talk about rotating the thighs back to feel more of a stretch. But it's different. Like for me, a stretch like that has always worked out really well. I've had room to improve upon it, but like this, which seemingly this should be similar type of flexibility, butterfly. This is the external rotation versus just leg moving laterally out, right? So seemingly it's hips opening wide, right? If you're really good at the straddle, shouldn't you be really good at this? Well, not necessarily, because there's a lot of other tissue that gets involved when the knees bend versus the legs being straight, and then it's a different motion for the hip, even though it's very similar. So for me, like I had a great straddle and my knees were like this and butterfly, and then I'm still better at a straddle, but I've become better at doing the external rotation. That was definitely a weakness for me. Internal rotation was always a little bit easier, actually. So that's kind of a good thing, considering I've experienced not nearly as much of that taught in classes. And you can see it in children a lot. Like kids will just flop into like a tortoise or a virasana a lot of times with their feet out, which is just like tremendous amount of flexibility on the knees and the hips. And you'll notice that kids sit cross-legged or sit in a tortoise, and they do that naturally. And a lot of times they might just gravitate towards one because that's what feels good, even though they might be like the harder version. Like I've had some friends who they didn't even do much yoga. They just sit on the floor and chill. They would sit like this a bit and they'd be, my knees hurt. And then they'd sit in, tortoise or virasana with the feet out and their knees going way in. And for me, that would really hurt my knees. For most people, that would hurt more. And for them, it's okay. So, it's very common. We have one or two directions we're really good at, and then others that we're not, right? So that's 5. We did external, internal, forward bend, flexion, back bend for the hip extension, and then we did the legs opening out straight, abduction, and then there's the leg going across to the midline. So, which is also something I don't think we do as much of. I think we do more abduction poses than what's called adduction. So, say for instance, I'm moving my leg over, I'm moving the hip socket like that, and then opening up this back part. That's an adduction, moving more to the center or beyond the center, right? And we see that more commonly with straight legs, but like demoing with the knee bent and then twisting like that is a little easier. But like if I were doing this and twisting, then that's a deep adduction. And then like, say for instance, if I'm doing rotated triangle, even though you may think that this is more of a stretch for the spine, the hip is in a little bit of an adduction as well. And to give another example of doing that, nothing else going on in the body other than being neutral, is again coming back to this and going across the midline. So if you have a lot of tightness in your hips, the backs of your hips, and your iliac crest, then something like that can be really good. So that's the 6 right there. There's external rotation, internal rotation, moving the hip forward, flexion, moving the hip back, extension, moving the legs out, abduction, moving the leg to the midline or even beyond, adduction. So that's the 6 right there. Now, what I would want people to do as their homework assignment is to observe their yoga practice and notice how you feel in all those different movements. Commonly, people have, whether it's part of their hips or their spine, they have their thing that's their thing. Or maybe it's more of a strength pose thing. People are the handstand person, or they're the splits person, or they're the backbend person. And they do that a lot. And that's good because it motivates you. It's something that you're good at. And it's nice to do things that you're good at. I understand that. But you get a lot of holistic health out of working on the things that you're not as natural at. The body is just more well-rounded by focusing on all the directions. So if you're noticing that the classes you're taking are skipping a certain direction of hip opening a lot, you don't have to, I'm not saying those classes aren't great and you shouldn't keep taking them. If you like it, keep doing it. But be aware of what's lacking, you know, the hips, but then beyond, you know, are you never doing very many twists? Well, then maybe you need to do more of those at home, right? Are you never doing some internal rotation or abduction? Well, then that can be what you do on your own, especially if you feel like you're not naturally good at that and if your body needs that. So I think, you know, I've observed a lot of people having pain in their sacrum and having a variety of things go on in our yoga experience. And, you know, I got injured from overtraining on my bike and having crashes and different things. And then there's certain genetic stuff my family's prone towards. But I've been the most injured from overdoing yoga and not doing yoga in a balanced way. And a lot of teachers have that experience. Some of us will admit it. A lot of people just sort of talk about it in the shadows. You know, there's a tremendous amount of famous teachers who've been on the cover of Yoga Journal and are like the glorified, you know, amazing gurus. They're all having hip replacements. You know, just like, oh, was it a good idea to do those side splits or do the over splits or do leg behind the head so many times? Like, maybe not. You know, that's sort of the dirty little secret of the yoga community. I mean, we talk about it, but we don't. It's more of sort of like a, you know, whispering in the corners versus being really open about it. Like, hey, maybe we've got some big problems we need to address by, you know, glorifying this sort of circus act of, you know, being able to do over splits and all this ridiculous shit that the body doesn't really need, you know? I mean, I joked earlier about having a picture of the splits. You go to my social medias. If you, most of it's like dark humor now, but if you look back far enough, you'll see a lot of pictures of deep back bends and splits and, you know, waves crashing and all that stuff. I'm not against it. I know from experience, and you do get a lot of good feelings and good vibes when people are giving you the comments and the like clicks and whatnot. But you know, nowadays I don't do splits very much, and it's, you know, I'm still pretty good at them, but like not as good as I used to be. But I'm better at like external rotation. Like, I'm better at being more well-rounded. I'm better at being a lot less injured. So it's just like, well, who was the better yogi? Me 10 years ago when I'm doing splits with like leg behind the head, holding it like that, you know, or me now that doesn't get injured as often. I don't know. I think I'm doing pretty good these days. I'll let you have your own opinion though. I mean, we're all entitled, you know. In the yoga community, we say, you know, it's like opinions are like Mula Bandha. Everyone has the potential to have one. So yeah, take a look at where your strengths and weaknesses are. Keep doing your strengths, feel good about that, but work on your weaknesses too, and see if that helps your body be more well-rounded. And by weaknesses, I'm referring to flexibility weaknesses, but also muscles that maybe you could use a little bit more muscle tone, you know, like maybe you can do crow and you can just bang it out and you're awesome at it. But then doing something like laying down and just lifting one leg, your leg shakes and you can't lift very high. Well, then that means that your abs are stronger than your hamstrings and glutes and low back. So work on that, and your hips and back are going to thank you for it, you know, or vice versa. You know, if your back and your glutes are super strong, but your abs are weak, then you need to work on that. Get really into those lower abdominals, which are going to be very helpful for your low back and sacrum. as well. So before we practice, I want to give people an option to ask live questions. So please feel free to type in some live questions. And then I'll lead us through a little hip opening practice. So don't all rush the stage at once, though. We'll take some questions. And
Mike says hi. Mike Fate.
oh, hi, Mike. Thanks for saying hi. Do you have a question, Mike? Don't be shy.
You might be watching him.
All right. Let's take a look. Let's see who's chiming in. When cross-legged, usually have one shin on top of the other. Yeah, somebody was mentioning when cross-legged, they usually have one shin on top of the other. So that's more of a comment than a question, but that is a good comment. So I'll talk about that. So when sitting cross-legged, unless you're very flexible, it helps to sit on something. Having a shin on top of the other, you're referring to like kind of having your legs like holding each other a little bit, I think. And so that props your knees up. So like I was talking about earlier, everything is going to have a benefit and a detraction, right? So what we talk about in cross-legged is that we want the hips and the knees to be level, or the hips higher than the knees. So without a pillow, if you sit and your knees are high because your hips are tight, which is really common, that's what most people are at, then your back's more likely to round, your knees and your hips are not going to be as comfortable. And so hips as high or higher than the knees. So the knees can be low is good. Your thighs will stretch a little bit. It's not a blatant quad stretch, but you stretch the thighs a little bit. Your hips have a better experience. You can sit up more straight with your back. Now, if your legs are crossed like this, that's probably going to be more comfortable on the knees because the knees going low is going to stretch the knees more. But if you don't sit up on lots of cushioning, your knees are going to be high and your hips are going to be low, and that makes you more likely to round your lumbar. I think the student who mentioned this is a cyclist. Is that right? So as a cyclist, you're already very likely, unless you have really good hamstring flexibility and you ride your bike like this, like high bars and really good pelvic tilt, most people don't, you're probably on your bike like this. So your back is in a rounded shape, and that's one of the natural directions the back does. So that's not just rounding the back itself isn't bad, but staying in a rounded shape for hours at a time without having good posture afterwards or without doing things to extend, do the opposite direction afterwards can be problematic. So try sitting with the ankles in front of each other, ankle in front of ankle, versus having the shins holding each other. If you can't do that, if you can't do ankle in front of ankle, then sit up on lots of cushions, especially if you're going to sit for a while. Like if you're sitting this whole talk and your back is rounded and your knees are kind of high and your hips feel uncomfortable, it's not going to be as good as sitting up. When in doubt, add another cushion. So, or if you're using a blanket or a towel, just double it over, fold it, and you have more height to sit on. And then the more often you're sitting cross-legged and doing hip opening stretches, then the easier it gets. Eventually you might not need cushions, but cushions are good to have. You can usually use your mat like a cushion. So if you're ever without a bolster, roll up the mat. It's not much of one, but you keep rolling it up, then you got something to sit on, and you got a built-in cushion. Doing meditation or yoga stretches at the beach is really awesome because you can just like pile a bunch of sand under your hips and you can create a natural bolster, you know? Same thing, if there's a lawn that's slanted, then that's nice for sitting on because then that naturally will lift up your hips. If there's a park that has a slanted lawn and you want to do some meditation or you want to do some stretches while sitting cross-legged, then that's nature's bolster right there. So those are some ideas for cross-legged sitting. And the shins holding each other is good if your knees hurt otherwise, but it causes other things you need to address, primarily the hips being too low. So stack them up and do it that way. And eventually when your hips open more, you probably don't need to have your shins holding each other. You have more of a staggered position. Like if my wrists were my ankles, you see how it's ankle in front of ankle versus holding the shins on each other. You get more opening by having ankle in front of ankle. All right. Any other questions? People are very shy in the virtual world. Okay, no problem. Let's go ahead and do a little bit of a practice. I'll give the option to take questions after that. And then we'll say goodbye. So, let's go ahead. And start in a nice child's pose with the knees wide. And we're going to hold this for several minutes. If you need to readjust your space, get ready for practicing after that long talk, then take your time. Just spend the first couple here stretching and relaxing. And if your knees don't feel really good, you can have maybe the feet together or a pillow between your heels and your hips. You can also just have your body more forward so your knees aren't bending as much. But if it does feel good, have your hips really far back, stretching out the back and the spine, having the arms lengthened forward and relaxing the shoulders and the forehead. Take deep breath. And exhale slowly. Couple more really long breaths. And we'll warm up a little bit on the hands and knees. So go ahead. When you're ready, round the back. To the back. And repeat. And this encompasses 2 of the natural movements of the spine. So when we're rounding the back, this is flexion of the spine. And we lengthen. We're either in neutral or a little bit of extension, a little bit of a back bend, and continuing. So like the hips, the back has 6 directions of movement. It's not that complicated. It's not that hard to do those 6. Now doing advanced versions of the movements in the spine, advanced back bends, advanced extensions, that is complicated and hard. But just doing a simple extension in the spine, it's easy to get in. So it's easy to do all the natural directional movements of the hips and spine. It doesn't take even more than 15 minutes. Let's go ahead and switch to having the right foot forward. And we'll do a runner's lunge. And we'll lengthen the back so that the knee is above the ankle and you can use your fingertips. My back is pretty straight here. Commonly, when people are less flexible, their hips are not as low and they're rounding their back, maybe hyperextending the chin and neck. It's better if you can have the hips be low and lift more. That's why people use blocks sometimes. If you're not able to do that without, if your flexibility is limited, you can do that. But even without blocks, you might be able to lift and hold the thigh. It's just not as stable on balance. But do what you can to have the back straight. So you're not just benefiting the legs, but you're benefiting the back as well. And this, like we talked about earlier, is a forward bend for the front leg and a back bend for the back leg. Flexion of the right leg, extension of the left, and preferably spine in neutral. Now we're going to go ahead and take the right hand on the knee and twist. So this is adding another spinal direction, right? We did rounded back, slightly arched back, flexion, extension. We're doing the cat rolls. Now we're doing a twist. So when we twist to the right, and then eventually on the next side, twisting to the left, that's 2 more directions of the spine. Right twist, left twist. And we'll come on down. And we'll go ahead and take child's pose. This time with the knees together, I like folding my arms under my head and letting the head really relax. Now, come on up and take a big step up with the left foot. Using your arm to help carry the leg is beneficial. Have the knee above the ankle and work on lifting the chest. And then holding the knee, pick your twist to the left. And then come on back to center. Just hold the runner a little bit. Remember, we're working on having a long spine and enjoying the flexion of the front leg. It stretches the hamstring connector. The extension of the back leg stretches the hip flexors. These muscles here, the inner thigh, 2 of them, there's 5 muscles in the hip flexor group. 2 of them run underneath the abdomen and connect to the low back. So seemingly this is a leg stretch, a hip stretch, but doing this regularly, very good for your back. And we'll take child again. And then come back to hands and knees. Lower all the way. And reach back through the feet. Now hands underneath the hips. And lift the right leg. And try and roll the knee in a little bit. Not too much, but just enough to keep the heel centered. And then lower. And lift the left leg. And roll the knee in a little bit. And then release. And then place the hands next to the chest. Not to be too high, but lengthen and open up in the chest. And come on down. Use the core and lift. Tuck under the toes. Dog stretch. And then knees down. All right, we're going to do another set of locusts, different types of locusts. And that's extending the chest, extending the back bend of the spine. So we're getting to that motion a little bit more deep than when we did the cat rolls. And it's also extending the hips. So extension for the hips. And I just want to talk very briefly about why doing the slight rolling in of the thighs is helpful. So when we stand, preferably the feet are even, but commonly we stand like this. And that gives us a wide base for balance, but it kind of works everything in. And it's one thing while we're standing, but then when we start to extend, we contract all these muscles. And if our heels are going in, and when you contract the muscles, that does make you more prone to having your leg roll out, right? So when the heels are going in, everything's pushing in a little bit more on this area of the low back and the S1 and the iliac spine and the sacroiliac joint right in through there. So if you can we talk about rolling in, it's not like we're trying to be pigeon-toed when we're doing those extensions, but if you just keep the feet neutral, and they tend to need to roll in a little bit to stay that way, to not have the thighs go out and the heels go in because the glutes are contracting, then it's typically much better on the sacrum. So sorry for breaking the flow there, but that's an example of why that's important. It's not just something we say because we were taught to say it. So let's lower down again, and we'll try a set of locusts. So lift legs and chest, and try and feel the knees roll in a little bit, and see if that takes pressure off your sacrum. And come on down. And then lift the legs and chest. Now extend the arms back. And then come on down. Next, we're going to take the arms and legs overhead. This is more strengthening on the upper back and shoulders. So if your neck hurts, just do one of the previous forms. Lifting arms and legs, and keep rolling the knees in. And then come on down, and taking the left arm under the forehead, and bending the right knee, and having the heel a little wider than the hip. Knee rolling in, and deep breath. So this is mainly stretching the quadricep, But by having the heel a little wide, then you're going to open up the hip. It's a little bit of an internal rotation, and that should help to free up the iliac spine and the sacroiliac joint. And go ahead and release. Let's do the other side. Have the heel wide, the knee rolling in a little bit, and then a lot of times the hips will lift up the front of the pelvis, and then that's putting pressure on the back. It takes pressure off the thigh, but it's better to press the hips down, press the front of the pelvis down, and then you'll stretch the thigh more. Just make sure you're not overdoing the knee, and you'll have more of a relaxed neutral back. So a lot of alignment will help go deeper into the muscles while taking pressure off the joints. And that's a good thing. The muscles are more resilient than the joints. So it's good if you have to choose between one or the other. Should I challenge the muscles or should I challenge the joints? And it's better to choose the muscles. Let's take some deep breaths. And we'll release from that stretch. Use the core and come on up. Take a turn and lightly hop the feet apart. So now we're doing a nice abduction stretch for both legs, and we try and have the back neutral. So the neutral refers to having our natural position, so a relative flat back. Deep breath here. And then bend the right leg. See how that feels. Don't overstretch, but go to a deep place. You can hold a little bit. So now one leg is less isolated in the stretch, but the other one is going deeper. And we'll do the other side. If you notice one side's a lot more tender or a lot more tight, then it's probably what you want to work on a little more. You go into it slower, but you do a little extra time. So just like I was talking about directional movements, how you want to work on your weaknesses, well, it's also right side, left side. It's very common that one side is stronger, one side's tighter. You want to even that out. The body's healthier when you even that out. Come back to center, and then we'll stand up. Maybe hold the hips, that can help your back. And then bring the legs closer together. And then stand facing forward on the mat. And then just to keep the body relatively warm, we'll do a chair pose. So you can lift the arms a little bit, otherwise lift the arms more, putting weight in the heels. Mostly focusing on stretching in this little practice, but a little bit of heat, a little bit of strength is good. And then next we'll do downward dog. Now if we do downward dog correctly, without rounding the back, so see how I'm lifting my hips high, and it's another example of having a forward bend for the hips. You're stretching the hamstrings, but not a forward bend for the spine. So if you do a lot of slouching or activities where you have to round your back, and it's good to have a straight back while you stretch the hamstrings. Then if your hamstrings are really tight, bending the knees works out great. All right, we're gonna kneel down and we'll adjust and have the legs in front. Maybe I'll face you, might work a little bit better. Do your best to sit up tall, maybe sit on a little towel or blanket. Open the feet a little bit wide. and then roll the hip socket. So we're doing external, internal, just loosening up the hip socket. And the aspects of strengthening is in the spine. So we're using our core to sit up tall as we just very gently loosen up the hip, and we do the other side. You can also massage your leg. If you're tight in your iliotibial band, you can massage that, massage the inner thigh a little bit, and by using the hands, you'll go further into your range of motion, and you can gently massage your muscles. When I teach this, I usually talk about that, and there's usually a student who's just doing this because they can without their hands, but the hands are nice to get that massage going. All right, and we're gonna go ahead and lower onto the back. And so that's external, internal, but it's not very deep internal rotation. So take knees to chest and have the feet to the ground. Make the feet wide and bend the knees in. If your knees hurt, you need to be very conservative with how wide you go with your feet. But if your knees feel good, then having the feet go pretty wide is nice. You get a nice release on the back. This is another example of internal rotation. And we're going to move the right knee in, the left knee away, and go back and forth. So this is a good little exercise. If you're not great at internal rotation, you feel like you're doing a lot more external rotation, doing this daily or at least, several times a week is a really nice, gentle, therapeutic exercise. And then the right knee goes in. And if you like, you can have the left ankle on the right thigh. This is much deeper, so make sure it's not too much on your knees or your hips, but having the side of the ankle on the outside of the thigh is really good for going deep into that internal rotation. There's a lot of other little muscles that get a stretch here too, which is nice. See how that feels and take deep breath. And go ahead and switch sides. Yeah, come back to the neutral form of the pose. And then slowly bring the feet together and open the knees. This is an external rotation with the knees opening. And if you feel discomfort in the low back, try using a pillow under the feet. And then knees lift. Next, we're going to do a cradle stretch. You have the ankle on the thigh and the knee works out. And if this is a big stretch, this is all you need to do. But if you want to stretch a little deeper, you can hold the hamstring, bring the leg in, or you can even hold the shin. You just want to keep the right foot flexed and keep the ankle from sickling, meaning the ankle stays in line with the lower leg bones, and the knee works out. Now this is an external rotation of the hip also, but it's a very different stretch, as you can see, than the reclined butterfly. So, because we're not just working on sections of the hip sockets range of motion, but all the muscles around it. So previously we were stretching the groin, now we're stretching the gluteus maximus and piriformis. And this is a very good stretch if you have low back pain or suffer from sciatic nerve pain, the pain that runs down the back of your leg into your heel. It's good to prevent that, and it's good to treat that as well. We'll go ahead and switch the sides. Start with the basic form. And bring it all in. Take 5 deep breaths. And go ahead and release the stretch. You may want a strap for this next stretch. We're going to bring the leg up, the right leg that is. And you can have the left leg bent. You can lengthen the leg. Typically when we just do this neutral, holding the calf and hamstring is good, but using a strap or a belt, bathrobe tie, is very good for doing the internal opening we're about to do. So this is the adduction that we're getting to, right? Covering all the bases now. See how this feels. And come back to center and release. Bend the knee in. Take the other side. Probably start with the bottom leg bent. Both legs bent works if your hamstrings are tight. Then eventually both legs can be straight. And you take the leg across. Sometimes it helps to hold with the other hand. The strap will work best, especially if you're still developing your flexibility. Having the knee a little bent could help. And come back to center. Release the legs, both sides. And bend the right leg and shift up onto the hip. This is also an adduction for the hip, perhaps less profound than the previous stretch versus this is including a twist in the spine. but it's all good to contribute towards healthy hips and spine. If you feel overstretched or a little stuck in the body, having both legs bent can be very helpful doing a basic twist. Otherwise, the length of the bottom leg allows you to get the knee more to the midline and increase that adduction stretch, which is really nice for releasing the back of the pelvis, the iliac crest and the sacroiliac joint. And come on back to center. And try the other side. And come on back to center. Hold the backs of the legs. Come on up. Sit cross-legged. Maybe sit on a blanket or a couple cushions. And we'll do a nice little lateral flexion for the spine. So take the hand on the ground, bring the arm over and stretch. Other side. So when we've done both sides of the lateral flexion, we're also completing the 6 natural movements of the spine. We've done 2 twists, 2 sides of lateral flexion. We did rounding, forward bending, and extension, back bending. So we've done all the directions of the hips and spine here. I'm going to teach us one more basic stretch, and then I'm going to show some poses that aren't going to be part of the structured practice, but that you might consider adding if you're ready for slightly harder stretches. So this is a really deep stretch, even if you're pretty flexible, but it's basic and accessible. So we have the ankles, instead of in front of each other, we have the ankles in front of the knees. So this is the square pose, hips back. And then come forward and feel a nice deep stretch in the glutes. If the ankles hurt, if the floor is hard, you can just back up, be on your mat, or put some sort of cushioning under your ankles. And enjoy this nice deep stretch in the glutes. It's also a forward bend for your back. And we'll do the other side now. So slowly lift up, switch which ankle is forward, and stretch. Deep breath, over stretching. You come on up. So that's the little practice I wanted to include, just to show you an example of all those different directions. We did the hips and the spine, and I talked a little bit about how they go together. It's a little bit more of a stretching practice. We definitely did some muscle tone things, but a little bit more of a stretching practice. And it is good to notice whether you're really loose jointed and very stretchy. Maybe you need a little bit more strengthening. If you're very stuck and stiff, you still need to even out your muscle tone. So you shouldn't give up on muscle tone practices, but maybe you focus a little bit more on stretching. The ideal is 50-50. You have a body that's equally strong and flexible, and most people are not in the ideal and not even close. So, and that's fine, but it's just good to know what to work on and how to aim for the ideal, even if you're not hitting the target, so long as you're working towards that and improving and learning more as you go along. And that's very good. So there's a couple other poses I'll mention, just to give honorable mention, that I think are really good, but maybe a little bit more intermediate or advanced than just everybody wanted to practice along with. So I'm not encouraging you to do these poses in the video, but consider building up to them over time, and I'll tell you some different purposes for them. And also feel free to keep hitting me up with the questions. Let's see if we have any coming in yet. Thanks for doing this, yes. All right. So far, just people saying hi. I posted on Instagram for the rush. Yeah, someone's mentioning the chest openers. Yeah, this is not focusing on the chest openers, but we did, if you were aware, when we're doing the locusts, it's subtle, but we're opening the chest when we're doing that. But yeah, chest openers, especially chest openers for cyclists, that's its own program. We could easily do 2 hours on that. Definitely we can do a long practice, but just discussing the issues of that and whatnot, maybe next week. The pose that I think is a good next step, if all those hip openers and those glute stretches were working for you, a really good dynamic pose and also potentially problematic pose is the swan. So I'm not really instructing this as for you to do it right now, but just for you to see it, right? Swan, a lot of people call this the pigeon. So this pose has the knee opening, the thigh is an external rotation, you're stretching the glute. The spine is an extension. When you're less flexible, you need your hands more forward. But eventually, if it doesn't hurt your joints, you can open your chest more like that. So it's kind of like cobra. Also, cobra is a very good pose to open up in the chest. But if your sacrum hurts, then this one may not be that great for you because the back is extending and there's just more pressure on that, especially if you're tight here and you are prone to injury in your sacrum. So this one is really good for the hips, and it has this potential of extending the spine. You extend the hip flexors, you get strong and flexible by doing this pose, but it can be very problematic for the front knee, the back sacrum, right? So if you're not there yet, then keep doing the square stretch. Remember this one we did? That was our last pose of the lead practice, and then laying down and doing the cradle, right? So the swan has the knee kind of wide. So in a sense, there's a little bit of the abduction in the femur and mostly external rotation. And the back leg might tend to go out, but it's better if you keep it centered and you keep squaring the hips, right? Doing it with a cushion under the hips is very good. And sometimes people have an injured knee and they can't do one side. And I hate to break it to you, don't shoot the messenger, but if you can't do one side, you probably shouldn't do the other. The other is already your good side. So what happens when you make your good side better while the other side stays weak? You know, you're better off. You end up just walking in circles eventually. You get stronger on your strong side, weaker on your weak side. It's a bad combination for evening out the body and being stable. And you're better off doing cradle on both sides and spending extra time slowly going to the tight side, being very ginger with it, but spending a thorough amount of time on it so you can even out. So that's the case. If there's a side you have to skip because you're hypermobile, because you're so flexible and it hurts, then that's maybe the exception when you can do the harder pose like the swan on the tight side and it doesn't hurt you. But usually people should modify both sides even if you only need to do one, because you don't want to make your stronger side stronger. You want to improve your weaker side. That's how you get good at yoga and stay healthy. And if you're a yoga teacher and you're always demoing on your strong side, it's a bad idea. It will lead to impressive demonstrations, but your body is going to pay for it. You're going to pay for that by doing that, especially if you teach for years and years and years, right? Demo on both sides or demo your, and, you know, just make a habit out of that, because a lot of yoga teachers get really out of balance, especially if they don't teach interactively and demo both sides when they're teaching. You just do one side and you do one demo and you choose the better one. If you don't go at home and do the weaker one twice, then you're going to throw yourself out of balance. And that's happened a lot. That's one of the things that we talk about when we get together and have our, you know, little kombuchas or tea or whatever. You know, it's like, oh yeah, I'm so tight on this side and I'm always demoing that the twist on the right because the left doesn't look as good or feel as good. It's like, well, that's why you're perpetuating that imbalance, you know. So you gotta work on that. It's a little tip, little tough love from Uncle Gabriel. The Virasana pose that I was showing earlier can be really hard on the knees, but it's a great internal rotation. It's great on the iliac crest and the sacrum and the sacroiliac joint. From my experience, like I said, we're all having unique experiences, so try it, but don't take my word for it as the rule of law. And Virasana is very problematic on the knees if you're not very flexible in your shins, ankles, and quads. So doing it one-legged is maybe a good place to start. And if even that is hard on your knees, what we did laying down where our feet were wide and knees bending together, that works for a lot more people. So that one's a good accessible way to get your internal rotation in. Try and remember to get your internal rotation and your abduction in. And interestingly enough, it feels really good to stretch the glutes and the piriformis when you have sciatica, sacroiliitis, fused sacroiliac joint or stuck joint. But a lot of those glute stretches are an external rotation, which can put a little bit more pressure on that area. So the last pose I want to show for you is the Gomukhasana, or what some people call the serenity pose. Now, I'm not showing you for you to do this right now. And if your knees are tight and things, the basic things we did were hard, then you definitely want to work up to it in the future, or not at all. But this pose I find to be a very dynamic hip pose, and it helped me with my hips, both the front hips and the back hips a lot. And so that's when you have one leg tucked in like this, the bottom leg, and then you bring the top leg around. Now, when you're doing this, at first you're very staggered, but you want to eventually have the legs mirror each other. If your knees are tight, definitely don't force it, and sit up on higher amounts of cushions. And eventually you can bring the knees to stack more and the feet start to be like mirror images of each other. So like The bottom leg is the lake, and the top leg is the mountain, and the reflection becomes more pure. It's hard to tell the difference between one or the other, the earth and the sky, when you get better at that pose. So what this does is it stretches the glute and the front of the hip. There's a lot of leverage pushing down into your legs. You can sit up straight, do all these different variations of stretching the chest and shoulders. You do twists, but what I like about this one is the glute stretch, especially if you do a forward bend. That's another great variation to do. But it's also an adduction, right? So whereas the swan, the knee goes out, it's an external rotation and a glute stretch. This is externally rotating your thigh, stretching the glute, but the femur is also going to the midline. See how my knee is right in the middle of my body, right? Adduction means going to the middle or going beyond the midline. So that adduction helps to open up the iliac crest and take pressure off the sacrum while reducing pressure on muscles that can hurt your sciatic nerve. So I find this one to be very helpful, and it's also very problematic if you're too tight to do it safely. So if your knees are killing you, or whatever, and you do it and you create a bad outcome, then it's a pose that's bad for you, right? Poses are good for you if they're good for you, if that makes sense. But if you can't do this, then you just need to remember, stretch the glutes, but don't do too much pressure on the sacrum, especially if you're acutely injured. And make sure to do the adduction, because we're probably bringing our arms wide, rolling our hips out. If we're doing normal yoga classes, we're probably doing that more. We probably need a little bit more internal rotation, a little bit more adduction, which means stretching toward the midline. So that one laying down, where you bring the leg over with the strap, that one's a pretty easy go-to. The recline twists, also very good for your back, just because twists are so good for your back. And those internal rotation ones, the reclined one, and then you can go knee in, knee out, back and forth, and maybe sitting in Virasana or half leg Virasana could be really good. So make sure to do all of the hip opening directions, but notice which ones are being left out, notice which ones are tight in your body, and emphasize those. Emphasize good amount of strengthening and a good amount of flexibility, and also emphasize rest from both deep stretches and hard muscle training days. So when you have all of that, then you can have more well-rounded approach. It's pretty rare that we hit the ideal and that we're on this perfect form, but we can get closer to it, and we can get to the point where our bad days are not as bad as they used to be. And that actually is a great sign of progress. So I'm just going to double check that there are not more questions. And having said all that, this has been about a couple hours. So I think we're almost ready to say goodbye. Well, let me write that down. Poses are good for you if they're good for you. Well, the video will be safe, so you can rewatch it if you need to take any notes. Yeah. Awesome. Well, anyhow, I think I'm going to wrap up. Tomorrow we're doing gentle yoga, gentle flow and restorative yoga. Just because you were shy about asking questions live doesn't mean you can't still ask some questions. You can DM me if you don't want to put them in the comments. You can put them in the comments and I'll respond to them. I can address things that you want to get to for future classes. So if you want to take my class and you do want to do some of those great chest openings, then hit me up, say, hey, can we do some good openings for the chest and shoulders today? And if it's appropriate for the class level, I can fit those in. Yeah, stay healthy, stay strong. I'm going to say goodbye to the YouTube live. Oh, also send money if you have it, if you have finances, this is for a donation. This is a longer program than an average class. So I'm suggesting the donation between $10 and $25. But if you have $2, send me that. If you have no money, you just need money for your food and your basic living expenses, then just share this to your friends and ask them to do the same, either give a contribution or share it with more of their friends. I'm really happy if this reaches a lot of people. So thank you so much for your support. I hope that hopefully you feel supported by the information that I have to give, and I will look forward to more interactive times together until we can meet again in person. So signing off of YouTube Live. Thank you, YouTube Live. Ending the YouTube Live. I'm going to go through